What was the craziest scandal at your school? I never thought I'd be hiding in a supply closet at 7:30 a.m. on a Tuesday, frantically screenshotting financial records on my phone while my heart hammered against my ribs. But there I was, crammed between boxes of printer paper and cleaning supplies, staring at numbers that made my stomach drop to the floor. $47,832. That's how much had disappeared from the Martinez Memorial Scholarship Fund in the past 18 months. Another $23,500 missing from the drama club's account. The robotics team. Down $15,200 from their fundraising efforts. All of it gone, siphoned off in neat little transactions of $500 here, $800 there, amounts small enough to slip under the radar but large enough to add up to something devastating. I'd only stumbled across this mess by accident. Mrs. Chen in the main office had asked me to grab some files from Principal Morrison's computer while she was in meetings. I'd been her student aide for 2 years, so it wasn't unusual. I was looking for the senior graduation requirements checklist when I clicked the wrong folder and found myself staring at spreadsheets that definitely weren't meant for student eyes. My hands shook as I scrolled through the documents. These weren't just random numbers, these were funds that dozens of families had worked their asses off to raise. My own mom had organized 3 separate car washes for the Martinez Fund last year, standing in the parking lot for 8 hours straight in July heat. The drama kids had sold cookies door-to-door for months to afford new lighting equipment. Mrs. Rodriguez in the cafeteria had been putting in unpaid overtime to help coordinate fundraising events. And Principal Morrison, the man who'd written my recommendation letters, who'd stayed after school to help me practice for scholarship interviews, who told me I had the potential to be valedictorian, had been stealing from all of us. The supply closet door rattled, and I nearly dropped my phone. Footsteps echoed in the hallway outside, accompanied by Morrison's familiar voice discussing budget meetings with someone. I held my breath until the sound faded, then quickly finished screenshotting the most damning pages. My phone's storage was nearly full, but I managed to capture transaction logs showing systematic transfers from student accounts into something labeled Administrative Discretionary Fund. When I finally crept out of the closet 20 minutes later, Morrison was standing by the main office counter, chatting with Mrs. Chen about the upcoming prom planning committee. He looked exactly the same as always, navy suit pressed to perfection, silver hair neatly combed, that warm smile that had made countless students feel heard and supported over his 15-year tenure at Westfield High. "Morning, Alex," he called out when he spotted me. "Ready for that calculus exam today?" "Yes, sir," I managed, my voice sounding weirdly normal despite the fact that my entire world had just shifted off its axis. "All prepared." He beamed at me with what I'd always thought was genuine pride. "That's what I like to hear. You're going to do great things, kid." I nodded and smiled back, playing the part of the grateful student while my phone burned like evidence in my pocket. $67,000. That number kept echoing in my head as I walked to first period, past bulletin boards advertising the spring fundraiser, past trophy cases filled with achievements bought with money that should have been helping kids like me afford college. I had no idea that in 6 hours, when I finally worked up the courage to call the school board, I discovered that Morrison had already prepared for this possibility. And his backup plan involved destroying my mother. The rest of that Tuesday crawled by like I was moving through molasses. I bombed the calculus exam, kept staring at the numbers on the page while different numbers flashed through my head. $47,832. $23,500. $15,200. Every time someone mentioned college or scholarships, my stomach twisted into knots. During lunch, I sat with my usual group in the cafeteria, picking at a sandwich I couldn't taste while Jake complained about how the robotics team couldn't afford to go to the state competition this year. "It's such bullshit," he said, stabbing his pizza with unnecessary force. "We raised over 20 grand at the beginning of the year. Mrs. Patterson keeps saying there were unexpected expenses, but like, what expenses? We're building robots out of spare parts and duct tape." I nearly choked on my water. Mrs. Patterson was the faculty advisor for robotics, but she didn't have access to their accounts. Only Morrison and the main office staff could authorize those kinds of transfers. Only Morrison and my mom. "Alex, you okay?" Sarah nudged my shoulder. "You look like you're about to hurl." "Just stressed about college stuff," I lied, which wasn't entirely false. My early admission to state was contingent on maintaining my grades and staying out of trouble. What I was about to do could jeopardize everything. After school, I drove home instead of staying for National Honor Society like I usually did. Our house sat at the end of Maple Street, a modest 2-story that my parents had been paying off for 12 years. Mom's Honda was already in the driveway. She got off work at 3:15, one of the perks of working at the school. I found her in the kitchen, still wearing her blue cardigan and the reading glasses she'd started needing last year. She was grading what looked like budget reconciliation forms, the same kind of documents I'd been staring at all day for very different reasons. "Hey, honey," she said without looking up. "How was the calc exam?" "Fine," I said, though we both knew that was probably a lie. Mom had helped me study for 3 hours Sunday night, patiently explaining derivatives while Dad watched his crime shows in the living room. "Mom, can I ask you something about work?" She glanced up, eyebrows raised. "You know I can't discuss confidential school business." "It's not. I mean, hypothetically, who has access to the fundraising accounts? Like, who could see where the money goes?" Mom set down her pen, giving me her full attention now. "That's oddly specific for a hypothetical question. Why do you ask?" I couldn't tell her. Not yet. Not until I understood the full scope of what Morrison had done and how deep this went. Just curious about how school finances work. "For, my government class." She studied my face for a long moment, and I could see her mental gears turning. My mom had always been good at reading people, it's what made her so effective in the finance office, catching discrepancies that others missed. "Well," she said slowly, "the principal has oversight authority for all accounts. The finance office processes transactions and maintains records. The school board reviews quarterly reports." She paused. "Alex, is there something specific you're worried about?" Before I could answer, my phone rang. Unknown number, but with a local area code. I almost declined it, but something made me pick up. "Is this Alex Chen?" The voice was crisp, professional, unfamiliar. "Yes, this is Alex." This is Patricia Williams from the Westfield School Board. We need to schedule a meeting with you and your parents regarding some financial irregularities at the high school. Are you available tomorrow after school? My blood turned to ice. I hadn't called them yet. Which meant Morrison had made the first move. The meeting was set for 3:45 p.m. Wednesday in the district administration building, a sterile brick structure that had always intimidated me, even when I was just there for academic award ceremonies. Mom spent the entire evening pacing around the kitchen, alternating between demanding I tell her what was going on and muttering about irregularities under her breath. 23 years I've worked for this district, she said for the fourth time as we sat in Dad's truck outside the administration building. 23 years without so much as a written warning, and now they're calling meetings about financial irregularities. Dad drummed his fingers on the steering wheel. Let's just see what they have to say, Linda. Could be routine. But I could tell from the tight set of his jaw that he didn't believe that any more than I did. We walked into the building together, our footsteps echoing off the polished linoleum floors. The receptionist directed us to conference room B, where Patricia Williams sat at a long oak table with two other board members I didn't recognize and a woman in a navy blazer who introduced herself as the district's legal counsel. Principal Morrison was already there, looking somber and professional in his charcoal suit. He nodded at us gravely as we took our seats across the table, and I noticed he avoided making direct eye contact with me. Thank you all for coming, Patricia Williams began, opening a manila folder thick with documents. We've discovered some concerning discrepancies in several student fundraising accounts at Westfield High. Mrs. Chen, as the primary finance officer handling these accounts, we need to discuss some transactions that occurred over the past 18 months. Mom's face went pale. What kind of discrepancies? Williams slid a printout across the table. Unauthorized transfers totaling $86,347 from various student activity and scholarship funds into personal accounts. The digital trail shows these transfers were processed using your login credentials between March 2023 and September 2024. I stared at the number. $86,347. That was even more than what I'd found in Morrison's files yesterday. My mom made a strangled sound and grabbed the paper with shaking hands. This is impossible, she whispered. I never authorized any personal transfers. I don't even have access to. The system logs show otherwise, the legal counsel interrupted. We have timestamps, IP addresses, and digital signatures. Every transaction was processed from your workstation during regular business hours. Morrison leaned forward, his expression pained. Linda, I want to believe there's an explanation for this. You've been such a dedicated employee, but the evidence is overwhelming. If you're having financial difficulties, if there are circumstances we don't understand. I'm not having financial difficulties. Mom's voice cracked. Tom, you know me. You know I would never steal from students. The way she said his first name, familiar, trusting, made my chest tighten. They'd worked together for 8 years. She'd organized a surprise retirement party planning committee just last month. Williams pulled out another document. We also have testimony from a concerned student who noticed irregularities and brought them to Principal Morrison's attention. Alex, you were the one who first discovered these discrepancies while helping in the main office, correct? Every eye in the room turned to me. Morrison's gaze was steady, expectant, and I realized with crystal clarity what he'd done. He'd taken my accidental discovery and twisted it, made me an unwitting witness to my own mother's supposed crimes. The man was brilliant, who would question a student reporting their own parent. My voice came out as a croak. I found some files, but... It takes courage to come forward when family is involved, Morrison said softly, and there was something in his tone that made my skin crawl. I know this is difficult, Alex, but the truth is important. He was daring me to contradict him. Challenging me to expose what I'd really found, knowing it would be my word against his. A 17-year-old kid versus a respected principal with 15 years of service and a reputation for integrity. Mom looked at me with confusion and hurt. Alex, what files? What are they talking about? My throat felt like sandpaper. In that moment, I understood exactly how trapped we were. The silence in that conference room stretched like a rubber band about to snap. Mom's eyes were locked on mine, waiting for an explanation that would either save her or damn her completely. Morrison sat perfectly still, his hands folded on the table, watching me with the patience of a predator who knew his prey was cornered. Alex, Patricia Williams prompted, can you tell us exactly what you found when you were accessing Principal Morrison's computer yesterday morning? Yesterday morning. They even had the timeline right. I wondered how long Morrison had been planning this, how many contingencies he'd mapped out in case someone stumbled across his theft. The sick part was how perfectly it all fit together. I really had been on his computer, I really had found financial discrepancies, and I really was the kind of student who might report wrongdoing, even if it involved family. The files showed missing money, I said carefully, my voice barely above a whisper. From student accounts. But... How much money? The legal counsel interrupted, pen poised over a yellow notepad. Morrison leaned back slightly in his chair. I caught the tiny movement, but more importantly, I caught the flash of something in his expression. Not satisfaction exactly, but a kind of cold calculation. He was measuring my words, ready to redirect whatever I said into his narrative. Around 67,000, I answered, sticking to what I'd actually seen in his original files. But the money wasn't going where you think it was going. Alex. Morrison's voice carried a note of gentle warning. I know this is hard, but we need to be completely honest here. Your mother has access to all these accounts. The system logs clearly show. The system logs can be manipulated. The words came out sharper than I'd intended, and I saw Williams and the other board members exchange glances. Mom grabbed my arm. Alex, what are you saying? Are you trying to protect me? Because I don't need protecting from something I didn't do. That was the thing that made this whole situation so twisted. Mom genuinely had no idea what was happening. She wasn't sitting there trying to figure out how to cover her tracks or minimize her involvement. She was confused and hurt and completely blindsided, which made her look either innocent or like a really good actress. Mrs. Chen, Williams said, do you have any explanation for how these transfers could have been made using your credentials without your knowledge? Mom's voice faltered. I mean, sometimes I leave my computer unlocked when I'm running between offices. And Tom, Principal Morrison, he has override access to all our systems for administrative purposes. But I can't imagine why anyone would want to frame me for this. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Morrison's expression shifted into something that looked like disappointment mixed with concern, but I was starting to see through his performances. Linda, that's a very serious accusation, he said softly. I understand you're scared, but suggesting that I would manipulate our financial systems to frame you. He shook his head sadly. That's not going to help your situation. It's not an accusation, I said, my heart hammering so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. It's a fact. The transfers weren't going to my mom's personal accounts. They were going to something called an administrative discretionary fund. And the authorization codes. Alex, stop. Morrison's voice cut through mine like a blade, and for just a second, his mask slipped completely. I saw anger there, and calculation, and something that made me understand exactly how dangerous this man really was. You're upset about your mother's situation, but making false statements isn't going to help anyone. Williams frowned, looking between us. What authorization codes are you referring to? Morrison stood up smoothly, straightening his tie. If I may suggest, this young person is clearly under tremendous stress. Perhaps we should continue this discussion with just the adults present while Alex processes this difficult situation. He was trying to get me removed from the room. To isolate Mom so he could control the narrative without my inconvenient details about discretionary funds and authorization codes. But I'd screenshotted those files, and they were still sitting on my phone in my backpack, burning like evidence that could save my mother's career and reputation. The question was whether anyone would believe them, or whether Morrison had already figured out how to explain those away too. No, I said, standing up so quickly my chair scraped against the floor. I'm not leaving. And I have proof. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Morrison's eyes narrowed for just a fraction of a second before his concerned principal expression slid back into place. Proof of what, exactly? Williams asked, leaning forward with renewed interest. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone, but my voice was steadier now. Proof that the money wasn't transferred to any account my mom had access to. Proof that someone with administrative override privileges moved $67,832 into a discretionary fund that only one person in this school can authorize. Alex, honey, what are you doing? Mom whispered, but I could hear hope creeping into her voice. Morrison stood up, his chair rolling backward. This is highly inappropriate. A student shouldn't be. Sit down, Tom. Williams's voice carried an authority that made even Morrison pause. Alex, show us what you found. I opened my photo gallery with fingers that felt like they belonged to someone else. The screenshots were all there, transaction logs, authorization codes, account numbers that didn't match anything in Mom's access permissions. I slid the phone across the table to Williams, whose expression grew more serious with each swipe. These images show transfers to account number 4471 ADM disk, I said, my voice gaining strength. That's not a personal account. That's an administrative discretionary fund that requires level 5 authorization. My mom only has level 3 access. The legal counsel leaned over Williams's shoulder, studying the screen. When were these screenshots taken? Yesterday morning, around 7:45 a.m. From Principal Morrison's computer in his office. Morrison's laugh was strained. This is exactly what I was afraid of. Alex, you've clearly doctored these images to protect your mother. It's understandable, but... The metadata will prove when they were taken, I interrupted. And you can check the system logs to see if anyone accessed those files from your computer yesterday morning. The timestamps will match. Williams looked up from my phone, her expression unreadable. Tom, why would Alex have been accessing these particular files on your computer? According to this, these are restricted financial documents that wouldn't normally be available to student aides. She was looking for graduation requirements, Morrison said quickly. She must have clicked the wrong folder and then. The graduation requirements are in a shared drive, Mom said suddenly, her voice getting stronger. They're not stored locally on individual computers. Alex wouldn't have needed to access Tom's personal files for that. I could see Morrison recalculating, trying to find a new angle. Linda, surely you're not suggesting that I would. Account 4471 ADM disk. The legal counsel was typing on her laptop now. I'm accessing the district's master account registry. This account was created 18 months ago with Principal Thomas Morrison listed as the sole authorized user. The account description lists it as emergency administrative expenses and discretionary educational funding. The silence that followed was deafening. Morrison sat back down slowly, his face pale but his posture still controlled. There could be a perfectly reasonable explanation, he said carefully. Administrative discretionary funds are sometimes necessary for urgent situations that can't wait for board approval. If there were temporary transfers. $86,000 worth of temporary transfers. Williams's voice was sharp now. Tom, what urgent situations required you to move scholarship money and activity funds without board oversight? I watched Morrison's face cycle through different expressions, surprise, hurt, confusion, like he was trying on masks to see which one fit best. Finally, he settled on wounded dignity. I can't believe you're taking the word of a teenager with doctored screenshots over my 15 years of service to this district. But I could tell from the way Williams was looking at him that the game had shifted. The trap he'd set for my mother was starting to close around him instead. They're not doctored, I said, my voice cutting through Morrison's protests. And I can prove it. I pulled up the phone's camera settings, showing the metadata information that displayed the exact timestamp, location data, and device information for each screenshot. Every photo has GPS coordinates that place me in your office at 7:43 a.m. yesterday. The school's Wi-Fi network information is embedded in the metadata. You can verify all of this with the IT department. Williams was already making notes. We'll absolutely be doing that. Tom, I'm going to need you to provide your login credentials so we can have IT pull a complete audit of all system access from your workstation. Of course, Morrison said smoothly, but I caught the slight twitch in his left eye. I have nothing to hide. Though I should point out that Alex clearly has some technical knowledge that could allow her to manipulate digital evidence. Mom let out a harsh laugh. Alex can barely figure out how to connect her phone to the car's Bluetooth. You think she's some kind of hacker? The legal counsel looked up from her laptop screen. I'm seeing more irregularities in the account history. Mr. Morrison, there are cash withdrawals from the discretionary fund totaling $31,200 over the past year. Can you provide documentation for how these funds were used? Morrison's composed mask finally started to crack. Those withdrawals, they were for various emergency expenses. I can provide receipts for most of them. Most of them? Williams raised an eyebrow. Tom, we're talking about public funds that require documentation for every penny. Most isn't acceptable. I felt a surge of vindication, but it was quickly followed by something that felt like nausea. This man had been my mentor. He'd helped me navigate college applications, written glowing recommendation letters, and made me believe I had a future worth fighting for. Watching him scramble to cover his tracks felt like watching a building collapse in slow motion. There's something else, I said quietly, pulling up another screenshot. The timing of the transfers. They all happened during school board meeting days, when the main office staff was busy preparing reports and presentations. Someone would have known exactly when Mom and the other finance office workers would be distracted. Mom stared at the screen, her face pale. That's true. Board meeting days are always chaos. We're pulling reports until the last minute, and Tom usually asks us to focus on getting the quarterly summaries together. She trailed off, the implications hitting her. You scheduled this meeting for today because you knew I'd find those files eventually, I continued, looking directly at Morrison. You couldn't delete them without raising suspicions, so you decided to get ahead of it. Make it look like Mom was the thief and I was the whistleblower who discovered her crimes. Morrison stood up abruptly, his chair rolling backward and hitting the wall. This is absurd. I've dedicated my entire career to these students, to this community. The idea that I would steal from scholarship funds. He shook his head, but his voice lacked the conviction it had carried earlier. Sit down, Tom. Williams's voice was ice cold now. We're not finished here. Actually, I think we are. Morrison straightened his tie with hands that weren't quite steady. I'm going to contact my attorney before this goes any further. This entire proceeding has become a witch hunt based on doctored evidence and wild accusations. He moved toward the door, but the legal counsel's voice stopped him. Mr. Morrison, as of this moment, you're suspended from all duties pending a full investigation. Your access to school systems and facilities is revoked immediately. Morrison turned back, and for just a moment, I saw pure rage flash across his features before he got control of himself again. You're making a serious mistake, he said quietly. All of you. Then he was gone, leaving behind the faint scent of his expensive cologne and a silence that felt heavy with the weight of everything that had just unraveled. Mom reached over and grabbed my hand, her fingers ice cold but her grip strong. Alex, she whispered, how did you know? How did you figure it out? I squeezed her hand back, my throat tight with emotions I couldn't name. Because I know you, Mom. And I'm finally starting to understand who he really is. The next morning brought a chaos I wasn't prepared for. By 7:30 a.m., there were 3 news vans parked outside Westfield High, and my phone had 17 missed calls from numbers I didn't recognize. Apparently, someone had leaked the story about Morrison's suspension to the local media, and, beloved principal accused of embezzling student funds, was trending on our town's Facebook groups. Mom and I sat in the kitchen, staring at the local news coverage on her laptop while Dad paced behind us, muttering about reporters and privacy laws. The anchor was interviewing random parents in a school parking lot, getting reactions that ranged from shocked disbelief to angry demands for answers. This is surreal, Mom said, watching a woman she'd worked with for 5 years tell Channel 7 that there had to be more to the story. Half these people have known Tom longer than they've known me. They can't believe he'd do something like this. My phone buzzed with another text from Sarah, *OMG Alex, are you seeing this? They're saying your mom might be involved too. *. I'd been getting messages like that all morning. The news reports were being careful about legal language, but the implication was clear, the investigation involved multiple school employees and potential conspiracy. Morrison might be suspended, but the court of public opinion was still deliberating. We need to go, I said, checking the time. I'm not missing school because of this mess. Dad stopped pacing. Alex, maybe you should stay home today. Let this settle down a bit. Absolutely not. I stood up, grabbing my backpack with more force than necessary. Morrison wants us to hide, to act guilty. I have advanced placement history first period, and Mrs. Rodriguez is reviewing for next week's test. I'm not letting him mess up my education any more than he already has. The drive to school felt like running a gauntlet. Reporters tried to flag down our car, and I spotted at least 3 people recording us with their phones as we pulled into the student parking lot. Inside the building, conversations died whenever I walked past, replaced by whispers that felt like insects crawling over my skin. Chen. Jake caught up with me at my locker, his robotics team jacket unzipped and his hair messier than usual. Dude, is it true? Did Morrison really steal our state competition money? It's more complicated than that, I said, spinning my combination lock. But yeah, it looks like he took funds from a lot of different accounts. Jesus. Jake slumped against the lockers. We worked so hard for that money. Bake sales, car washes, that stupid haunted house fundraiser where I had to dress like a vampire for 6 hours straight. His voice cracked slightly. Some of the guys are seniors. This was their last chance to compete. The guilt hit me like a physical blow. I'd been so focused on clearing Mom's name and exposing Morrison that I hadn't fully processed what his theft meant for students like Jake. Real kids who'd lost real opportunities because a trusted adult had decided his wants mattered more than their dreams. We're going to fix this, I told him, though I had no idea how. The school board is investigating. Maybe they can recover some of the money. Maybe. Jake didn't sound convinced. But the competition deadline is next Friday. Even if they find the money tomorrow, we can't exactly time travel back to when registration was open. First period was torture. Mrs. Rodriguez tried to treat everything normally, but I could feel 26 pairs of eyes tracking my every movement. During the Revolutionary War review, she asked about taxation without representation, and someone in the back row made a crack about insider information and family corruption that made my cheeks burn. By lunch, I was ready to scream. The cafeteria felt like a fishbowl, with clusters of students stealing glances at my table while they whispered among themselves. Sarah and my usual group had closed ranks around me, but their protective loyalty only made the isolation more obvious. "This is insane," Sarah said, stabbing her salad with unusual violence. "People are acting like you personally stole their lunch money." "Morrison was popular," I said quietly, picking at my sandwich. "He's been here longer than most of these kids can remember." "I'm just the student who brought him down." "You're the student who exposed a thief," corrected Marcus, who usually stayed out of drama but had apparently decided this was worth speaking up about. "There's a difference." Before I could respond, Mrs. Patterson from the robotics program appeared beside our table, her expression grim. "Alex? Could I speak with you privately?" The bottom dropped out of my stomach, but I followed her to an empty classroom down the hall. Mrs. Patterson closed the door and turned to face me, her arms crossed over her chest. "I need to ask you something directly," she said without preamble. "Did you know about the missing robotics funds before yesterday's meeting?" The question felt like a trap, but I was getting tired of walking on eggshells around the truth. "I found evidence of transfers from your account on Tuesday morning. But I didn't know what had happened to the money until I saw Morrison's discretionary fund records." She studied my face for a long moment. "The kids are devastated, Alex. Some of them have been working on their competition robots since September. Is there any chance, any possibility at all, that this is a misunderstanding? That the money might be recovered in time?" I thought about the cash withdrawals the legal counsel had mentioned, the $31,200 that Morrison had pulled from the discretionary account over the past year. Money that had probably been spent on his expensive suits and weekend trips, impossible to recover even if they managed to prosecute him successfully. "I don't think so," I said honestly. "I'm sorry. I'm really, really sorry." Mrs. Patterson's shoulders sagged. "It's not your fault, Alex. You did the right thing. But that doesn't make it any easier to tell 17 kids that their dreams just evaporated because an adult they trusted decided to rob them blind." As she left, I realized that clearing Mom's name was only the beginning of this nightmare. Morrison's theft hadn't just hurt abstract, student accounts, it had stolen futures, opportunities, and dreams from kids who'd worked harder than they should have had to for a chance at something better. And somehow, I was going to have to live with being the person who'd expose that truth. The worst part about becoming the center of a scandal is how quickly you learn who your real friends are. By Thursday morning, my usual lunch table had shrunk from 8 people to 4. Marcus and Sarah were still there, along with Jamie from my AP chemistry class, but everyone else had found reasons to sit elsewhere. I told myself it didn't matter, but the empty chairs felt like accusations. I was digging through my locker after second period when I heard familiar voices behind me. "I still can't believe Alex would do that to her own mother," whispered Kristen Walsh, who'd sat 2 seats behind me in Morrison's college prep seminars for the past 2 years. "Like, I get wanting to be honest, but throwing your own family under the bus." "Maybe she didn't have a choice," replied David Chin, no relation, despite the shared last name. "If the evidence was that obvious." "Please. You really think she just accidentally found those files?" "She was probably snooping around trying to find dirt on Morrison because she was mad about something. And when she couldn't pin it on him, she let them blame her mom instead." My hands froze on my chemistry textbook. The story had gotten twisted somewhere between the school board meeting and the gossip network, morphed into a version where I was either a naive whistleblower who'd accidentally destroyed my own mother or a vindictive student who'd orchestrated the whole thing for unknown reasons. That's not what happened. I turned around to face them, my voice sharper than I'd intended. "Morrison framed my mom. I proved he was the one stealing the money." Kristen's cheeks flushed, but she didn't back down. "Then why is she still under investigation? If you really proved she was innocent, wouldn't they have cleared her by now?" The question hit like a punch to the gut because I'd been wondering the same thing. Yesterday's school board meeting had ended with Morrison suspended and my evidence being sent for forensic analysis, but Mom was still on administrative leave, pending the completion of the investigation. The district's official statement talked about multiple ongoing inquiries and the complexity of financial fraud cases. "These things take time," I said, but even I could hear how weak that sounded. David shifted uncomfortably. "Look, Alex, we're not trying to be jerks. It's just. Morrison helped a lot of us with college stuff. He wrote recommendation letters, stayed after school for interview practice. It's hard to believe he'd steal from students." "Believe it," said a voice behind me. I turned to see Tyler Martinez, a junior whose older sister the scholarship fund had been named after. She died in a car accident 3 years ago, and their family had worked tirelessly to create a memorial fund for students who couldn't afford college. "My parents just found out that bastard stole almost $50,000 from Maria's fund." Kristen paled. "Tyler, I didn't know." $47,832, Tyler continued, his voice getting louder. "Money that families donated at my sister's funeral. Money my mom raised by working double shifts at the diner. Money that was supposed to help kids like Maria who had big dreams and no way to pay for them." He looked directly at Kristen and David. "So maybe think twice before you defend him, okay?" The hallway had gone quiet around us, students slowing their pace to listen. Tyler's words hung in the air like a challenge, and I saw several people look away uncomfortably. "I'm sorry," Kristen mumbled. "I didn't realize." "None of us realized," Tyler said, his anger deflating into something sadder. "That's what made him so good at it." As the crowd dispersed and the bell rang for third period, Tyler caught my arm. "Alex, my parents want to thank you for speaking up. They know it couldn't have been easy." I nodded, not trusting my voice. Because the truth was, it was about to get a lot harder. My phone buzzed with a text from Mom, *, need to talk. Meet me at home after school. Important, *. The message felt ominous, especially since Mom never left work early. But when I walked through our front door at 3:45, I found her sitting at the kitchen table with papers spread out in front of her and an expression I'd never seen before. "Alex," she said without preamble, "we have a problem. A big one." The paper spread across our kitchen table looked like evidence from a crime scene, bank statements, printouts, and official documents with letterheads I didn't recognize. Mom's laptop was open to what looked like legal documents, and her coffee mug sat untouched, probably cold. "Sit down, honey," Mom said, her voice carrying a weight that made my stomach drop. "We need to talk about what Morrison did to prepare for this." I slumped into the chair across from her, my backpack hitting the floor with a thud. "What do you mean, prepare?" Mom turned her laptop screen toward me. "The school board's forensic accountant found something else today. Morrison didn't just steal money and frame me for it. He created a paper trail going back 2 years that makes it look like I've been systematically skimming funds for my own use." My blood turned to ice. "What kind of paper trail?" "Fake receipts showing cash withdrawals I never made. Forged authorization forms with my signature. Fabricated vendor contracts that supposedly paid inflated amounts to companies that don't exist." She pointed to a document on the screen. "Look at this, it's a receipt for office supplies dated 6 months ago, showing I approved a $2,400 cash payment to Martinez Educational Services." I leaned forward, studying the document. The signature looked exactly like Mom's handwriting, down to the little flourish she always added to the L in Linda. "But you didn't sign this?" "I've never seen this receipt before in my life. And Martinez Educational Services isn't a real company," I checked. "But the receipt exists in our filing system, scanned and dated, with digital timestamps showing it was uploaded from my workstation during my lunch break on October 15th. The sophistication of it took my breath away. Morrison hadn't just panicked when I found his theft, he'd been building this elaborate frame job for months, maybe years. Creating false evidence piece by piece, knowing that someday he might need a scapegoat. "There's more," Mom continued, pulling out a bank statement. "Someone opened a savings account at First National Bank 3 months ago using my social security number and a fake ID. The account has been receiving regular deposits, small amounts, $300 here, $500 there. The bank security cameras show a woman who could be me making the deposits, though the footage is conveniently blurry." I stared at the statement, my hands shaking. How is that even possible? Morrison had access to all our personnel files, including social security numbers and emergency contact information. And think about it, Alex, how many times have you been to school events where he was taking photos, or staff meetings where people were recording presentations? He could have hours of video footage to work with. The implications hit me like a sledgehammer. Morrison hadn't just stolen money and hoped no one would notice. He'd spent months creating an alternate reality where my mother was a sophisticated embezzler who'd been stealing from students for her own benefit. Every receipt, every forged document, every fake transaction was another brick in a wall designed to destroy her life. "The forensic accountant says the evidence against me is actually more comprehensive than the evidence against Morrison," Mom continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "His lawyer is already arguing that I was the mastermind and he was just an unwitting accomplice who trusted his finance officer too much." I felt sick. "But my screenshots, the discretionary fund, the authorization codes that prove it was him. They're calling those fabricated. Morrison's claiming you doctored them to protect me after you realized I'd been caught." Mom's laugh was bitter. "He's painting you as a loyal daughter who tried to save her criminal mother by framing an innocent principal." The kitchen felt like it was spinning around me. We'd walked into that school board meeting thinking we had proof, thinking we could expose Morrison and clear Mom's name. Instead, we'd walked into a trap that had been months in the making. "Mom," I said, my voice cracking, "what happens now?" She was quiet for a long moment, staring at the fake bank statement spread across our table. When she finally looked up, her eyes were red but determined. "Now we prove that Tom Morrison is a sociopath who spent 2 years planning to destroy me. And we better do it fast, because his version of the story is a lot more convincing than ours." The call came at 6:47 a.m. Friday morning, jolting me awake from the first decent sleep I'd had all week. Mom's voice carried down the hallway from the kitchen, sharp and panicked in a way that made my stomach clench before I was even fully conscious. "What do you mean they executed a search warrant? We weren't notified." I stumbled out of bed and found her pacing in front of the coffee maker, still in her bathrobe, phone pressed to her ear. Dad stood by the window, peering through the blinds at something outside that made his jaw tight. "Okay, yes, I understand. We'll be there within the hour." Mom ended the call and turned to us, her face pale. "That was Patricia Williams. The FBI executed a search warrant on our house last night. They have boxes of evidence they claim were hidden in our basement." My blood turned to ice. "What kind of evidence?" "Cash. Lots of it, apparently. Along with forged documents and what they're calling financial planning materials that show how the stolen money was laundered." She sank into a kitchen chair. "Tom, they found $23,000 in cash in a box behind our water heater." Dad let the blinds snap shut. "There are still 2 agents in an unmarked car across the street. They've been there since I got up at 6. I felt like I was going to throw up. "Mom, we need to call a lawyer. Like, right now." "I already did. Janet Morrison is meeting us at the district office in an hour." Mom paused, then added with dark irony, "She's Tom Morrison's ex-wife, actually. Divorced him 5 years ago. Apparently she's very interested in our case." The drive to the district office felt surreal, like we were characters in someone else's nightmare. I kept checking the mirrors for FBI surveillance, wondering if they were monitoring our conversations, if our phones were tapped. 3 days ago, my biggest worry had been maintaining my GPA for college applications. Now I was living in some twisted crime drama where my family was being framed by a man I'd trusted for years. Janet Morrison turned out to be a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s with graying hair and a kind of intense focus that made me understand why she'd been a prosecutor before switching to defense work. She was waiting for us in conference room B, the same room where this nightmare had started, with files stacked 3 feet high on the table. "Let me start with the good news," she said without preamble. "Tom is an arrogant sociopath who thinks he's smarter than everyone else. That's going to be his downfall." Mom blinked. "That's the good news. Trust me, in cases like this, having a defendant who can't resist showing off is a gift." Janet opened the first file. "Tom spent 2 years creating this frame job, but he got sloppy because he was so convinced of his own brilliance. The cash they found in your basement. The serial numbers are sequential, which means it came from a single source, most likely a bank withdrawal from his discretionary account. I leaned forward. Can you prove that? We're working on it. The bigger issue is the timeline Tom created for your supposed crimes, Linda. According to his fabricated evidence, you've been stealing money since March 2022. But there's a problem with that date. Janet pulled out a medical record and slid it across the table. March 15th through April 30th, 2022, you were on medical leave following your gallbladder surgery. You literally weren't in a building for 6 weeks, yet somehow you managed to authorize 17 different fraudulent transactions during that period. Mom stared at the document. I completely forgot about that. The surgery, the recovery time. Tom forgot about it too. He was so focused on creating a comprehensive pattern of theft that he didn't check his dates against your employment records. Janet's smile was predatory. It's the kind of mistake that unravels entire conspiracies. For the first time in days, I felt a spark of hope. But it died quickly when Janet opened the next file. Unfortunately, Tom's been busy since our last meeting. He's hired Crawford, Mills and Associates, they're the best white-collar defense firm in the state. And they've just filed a motion claiming that Alex's screenshots were created using AI technology to fabricate evidence. My heart sank. AI technology? I don't even know how to use Photoshop, let alone artificial intelligence. They don't need to prove you actually did it. They just need to plant reasonable doubt about the authenticity of your evidence. Janet's expression was grim. Tom's new story is that you're a technically gifted student who became suspicious of your mother's activities and decided to frame him to protect her. The AI angle makes it sound plausible to a jury who might not understand the technical complexities. Mom grabbed my hand across the table. This is insane. Alex is 17 years old. She's not some criminal mastermind. No, but she is valedictorian material with a perfect record and demonstrated computer skills from her programming classes, Janet pointed out. Tom's lawyers are going to argue that she had both the capability and the motivation to create sophisticated fake evidence. I felt the walls closing in around us. Every move we made seemed to strengthen Morrison's narrative while making us look more guilty. The man had turned our own strengths, my academic achievement, Mom's long employment record, our close family relationship, into evidence of a conspiracy. So what do we do? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Janet closed the files and looked directly at me. We prove that Tom Morrison is exactly the kind of man who would spend 2 years framing an innocent woman for his crimes. And we start by finding out what really happened to his first wife. The words, first wife, hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. I stared at Janet Morrison, trying to process what she'd just said. First wife. Mom's voice was barely a whisper. I thought you were his only wife. Janet's expression darkened. Tom was married before me, from 1998 to 2003. Her name was Rebecca Chen, no relation to you, despite the name. She worked as a bookkeeper for a nonprofit in Sacramento that mysteriously lost $40,000 in donor funds right before their divorce was finalized. My stomach dropped. Let me guess, she was blamed for the theft. Never formally charged, but the investigation destroyed her career and reputation. She moved to Oregon afterward, changed her name, and has been working as a waitress ever since. Janet pulled out a photograph of a woman who looked eerily familiar, same build as Mom, similar hair color, even comparable handwriting style based on the signature samples attached to the file. Jesus, Dad breathed. He has a type. More than that. He has a pattern. Janet spread out a timeline she constructed. Rebecca Chen, 2003, bookkeeper framed for nonprofit theft. Sarah Martinez, 2011, his girlfriend in Colorado who was accused of embezzling from the school district where they both worked. Linda Chen, 2024, current target. All brunettes, all in their 40s, all working in financial positions where they had access to accounts but not ultimate authority. I felt sick realizing how calculated this was. You're saying he's been doing this for 20 years? I'm saying Tom Morrison is a predator who specializes in finding trustworthy women in financial positions, gaining their confidence, stealing money, and then destroying their lives to cover his tracks. Janet's voice carried a cold fury. Rebecca Chen lost her career, her savings fighting the accusations, and her marriage to the stress. Sarah Martinez moved 3 states away and now works retail because no school district will hire her. Tom walks away clean every time, usually with a promotion and glowing references. Mom was staring at Rebecca's photo with a horrified expression. How did you find all this? Rebecca contacted me 2 days ago. She's been following the news coverage of Tom's suspension, and she recognized the pattern immediately. Janet pulled out a handwritten letter. She's willing to testify about what Tom did to her, but there's a problem. Of course there was a problem. There was always a problem. Rebecca's case is old, and she never pressed charges. Tom's lawyers will argue that she's a disgruntled ex-wife seeking revenge. They'll claim her testimony is irrelevant to current charges. Janet paused. But if we can prove Tom used the same methods to frame Rebecca that he's using to frame Linda, it establishes a clear pattern of behavior. I leaned forward, my mind racing. What kind of methods? Forged signatures. Fake receipts. Sequential cash withdrawals made to look like systematic theft. Janet opened another file. Rebecca kept copies of everything from her case. The fabricated evidence Tom created in 2003 is remarkably similar to what he's created now. Same techniques, same attention to detail, even some of the same fake vendor names. Mom grabbed the file, scanning the documents with growing amazement. Martinez Educational Services, he used that fake company 20 years ago too. Tom's not as creative as he thinks he is. The man's been recycling the same con for 2 decades, just updating it with better technology. Janet's smile was sharp. That's going to be his downfall. But as I studied the timeline, a new fear crept in. If Morrison had been doing this for 20 years, destroying lives and walking away clean, what made us think we could be the ones to finally stop him? Especially when his current frame job was the most sophisticated yet, and the stakes had never been higher. The breakthrough came from the most unexpected source imaginable, Morrison himself. Janet had arranged for us to meet Rebecca Chen at a coffee shop in Portland, a 3-hour drive that felt like a pilgrimage to uncover the truth. Rebecca turned out to be quieter than I'd expected, with nervous hands that shook slightly when she held her coffee cup, but her memory of Morrison's methods was razor-sharp. He always started the same way, she explained, pulling out a manila envelope thick with photocopied documents. Small amounts at first, testing the systems, learning the authorization protocols. Then he'd create what he called administrative emergency accounts that only he could access. The parallels to what we'd found were chilling. Even the account naming conventions were identical. Morrison had used 4,471 ADM disk at Westfield High, while Rebecca's nonprofit had lost money to 3,391 ADM EMRG. Different numbers, same pattern. The scariest part was how methodical he was about the frame job, Rebecca continued. He spent months studying my handwriting, my work habits, even my lunch schedule. By the time the theft was discovered, he had created a complete alternate history where I was this sophisticated embezzler who'd been planning it for years. Mom leaned forward. How did you finally prove your innocence? Rebecca's expression darkened. I didn't. I ran out of money for lawyers, lost my job, and moved across the country to start over. Tom won by default. She paused, then added with quiet intensity, but I never stopped documenting his methods. 20 years of collecting evidence, waiting for him to surface again. That's when she opened the second envelope, and my heart nearly stopped. Tom's weakness has always been his ego, Rebecca said, spreading out printed emails across the coffee shop table. He can't resist bragging about his intelligence, especially to people he thinks he's outsmarted. After he destroyed my life, he kept in touch, Christmas cards, occasional emails, always friendly and concerned about my situation. Janet picked up one of the emails, dated just 6 months ago. Rebecca, this is him confessing. I read over her shoulder, my hands shaking. Morrison's email was disguised as sympathetic concern for Rebecca's ongoing financial struggles, but between the lines was something far more sinister. Asterisk, I often think about how differently things might have turned out if you'd been more careful with those Sacramento Community Foundation records. The sequential cash withdrawals were particularly damaging to your case, almost like someone wanted to create an obvious pattern. Of course, hindsight is always 20/20ths. I just hope you've learned to be more cautious about document security and authorization protocols in your current position, asterisk. Holy shit, I whispered, then immediately apologized for the language. But Janet was grinning like she'd just won the lottery. This isn't just evidence, she said. This is Tom Morrison detailing his exact methods while pretending to offer sympathy. Sequential cash withdrawals, document security, authorization protocols, he's literally explaining how he framed Rebecca while maintaining plausible deniability. Rebecca pulled out more emails, spanning 15 years. He does this periodically. Reaches out with friendly advice about financial management, always referencing specific details from my case that only the real thief would know. Mom stared at the papers in disbelief. Why would he do that? Why risk exposing himself? Because he's a narcissist who needs his victims to know how clever he is, Janet replied. Tom can't just steal money and disappear, he needs to twist the knife, to prove his intellectual superiority over the people he's destroyed. I thought about Morrison's behavior at the school board meeting, the way he tried to control the narrative even when his lies were falling apart. The man couldn't resist performing, even when performing might destroy him. There's more, Rebecca said quietly. Tom sent me an email 3 days ago, right after the news about Westfield High broke. She handed me a printed message that made my blood run cold. Asterisk, saw the news about your namesake in Oregon. Such a familiar pattern, trusted employee, missing funds, family involvement. Some people never learn to cover their tracks properly. I hope young Alex Chen is better at technology than documentation suggests. These cases can be so hard on families. Asterisk. Morrison wasn't just framing my mother. He was taunting his previous victim while threatening me directly. And that email was going to bring him down. The email Rebecca showed us was Morrison's biggest mistake, but it also revealed something that made my hands shake as I held the printout. He knew things about my technology skills that weren't public knowledge. Details that suggested he'd been monitoring me far more closely than any of us had realized. Janet, I said, my voice barely steady, how would Morrison know about my documentation methods? The news reports didn't mention anything specific about how I found the evidence. Rebecca's expression darkened. What exactly did the email say about your technology skills? I reread the message, focusing on the phrase that had made my stomach drop. I hope young Alex Chen is better at technology than documentation suggests. That's not random commentary, Janet said, her prosecutor instincts kicking in. Tom is referencing something specific. Alex, have you had any unusual interactions with technology recently? Computer problems, software issues, anything that seemed off? My mind raced back through the past week. The school laptops have been acting weird lately. Mine keeps logging me out of applications, and yesterday my saved files were in different folders than where I left them. I paused, a chill running down my spine. But I thought it was just the usual school IT problems. Tom has administrative access to all student accounts, Mom said quietly. He could monitor email, file access, even keystrokes if he wanted to. Janet was already pulling out her phone. We need to get your laptop to a forensic IT specialist immediately. If Tom has been monitoring your digital activity, it means he's been planning this frame job specifically around you and your mother for weeks, maybe months. Rebecca gathered the emails with practiced efficiency. This is exactly how he operated in Sacramento. Tom would study his targets obsessively before making his move, learning their routines, their relationships, their vulnerabilities. The fact that he's been watching Alex means you two were selected specifically for this. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Morrison hadn't just panicked when I discovered his theft, he'd been preparing to use me as an unwitting accomplice in framing my mother long before I ever touched his computer. There's something else, Rebecca continued, pulling out a final document. Tom's pattern always includes an exit strategy. He never stays in one place long enough for multiple victims to compare notes or for investigators to spot the connections. She handed me a job posting from the Oregon Department of Education, dated just 2 weeks ago. Morrison had applied for a superintendent position in Bend, Oregon, a promotion that would have taken him far from Westfield High and any uncomfortable questions about missing student funds. He was already planning to leave, I realized. Even before I found those files, he was setting up his next position. Janet's expression was grim as she studied the application timeline. Tom probably intended to let this frame job play out after his departure. Your mother would be arrested, the case would be closed, and he'd start fresh in Oregon with glowing references and a reputation as the dedicated principal who'd helped expose corruption in his district. Mom's voice was barely a whisper. How many other families has he destroyed like this? Based on the pattern Rebecca and I have identified, at least 6 that we can document. Probably more. Janet closed her files with sharp efficiency. But Tom Morrison just made his first real mistake in 20 years of cons. That email to Rebecca isn't just evidence, it's a confession written in real time while he's actively committing the same crime. As we prepared to drive back to Westfield with our newfound evidence, I couldn't shake the feeling that Morrison's email had been too convenient, too perfectly incriminating. The man had been successfully destroying lives for 2 decades by being meticulous and careful. Why would he suddenly get sloppy now, unless he wanted us to find that message? The realization hit me like ice water in my veins as we drove back toward Westfield. Morrison's email to Rebecca wasn't a mistake, it was bait. Pull over, I said suddenly, grabbing Janet's arm from the back seat. We need to stop right now. Dad swerved into a gas station parking lot, alarm clear on his face. Alex, what's wrong? I pulled out my phone with shaking hands, scrolling back through the timeline Janet had constructed. The email Morrison sent to Rebecca, it came 3 days after the school board meeting. 3 days after he knew we had evidence against him. Janet frowned. What are you getting at? Morrison's been successfully framing people for 20 years by being careful and methodical. Why would he suddenly send an email that basically confesses to his crimes? My voice was rising with panic. Unless he wanted Rebecca to find us. Unless he's been planning for this exact scenario. Mom turned around in the passenger seat, her face pale. Alex, what are you saying? I'm saying we just spent 4 hours away from Westfield, during which time Morrison knew exactly where we were and what we were doing. I pulled up the news on my phone, my worst fears confirmed by the headline that appeared, New Evidence Surfaces in Westfield High Embezzlement Case. The article, posted just 2 hours ago, detailed how anonymous sources close to the investigation had provided authorities with additional documentation proving Linda Chen's guilt. Bank records showing a pattern of systematic theft going back 3 years. Security footage of someone matching her description making suspicious cash deposits. Even testimony from concerned community members who'd noticed her expensive purchases that seemed inconsistent with her school salary. Janet snatched the phone from my hands, her face darkening as she read. Son of a bitch. Tom used our absence to plant even more evidence. He knew we'd chase the Rebecca connection, and he used those 4 hours to salt the mine with fresh fake documents. But how could he work that fast? Dad asked. Creating fake bank records, security footage. He's had months to prepare contingency plans, Rebecca said quietly from the back seat. Tom always thinks 3 moves ahead. He probably has fabricated evidence ready for every possible scenario, including us finding each other. My phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I answered hesitantly, putting it on speaker. Alex Chen. This is Detective Sarah Rodriguez with the Westfield Police Department. We need you and your mother to come in for questioning immediately. New evidence has surfaced that significantly changes the scope of this investigation. Janet grabbed the phone. This is Janet Morrison, the family's attorney. What kind of new evidence? Ma'am, I can't discuss details over the phone, but I can tell you that we now have documentation showing a conspiracy between Linda Chen and her daughter to embezzle funds and frame Principal Morrison. We have a warrant for Mrs. Chen's arrest. The world seemed to tilt sideways. Everything we discovered about Morrison's pattern, all of Rebecca's evidence, the emails that proved his methods, none of it mattered because he'd spent our afternoon creating an even more convincing narrative where Mom and I were criminal masterminds working together. We'll be there within 2 hours, Janet said tersely. And Detective Rodriguez? I hope you verified the authenticity of this new evidence very carefully, because what you're describing sounds exactly like the kind of sophisticated frame job my client has been warning you about. After she hung up, the silence in the car was deafening. Morrison had turned our investigation into proof of our guilt, our family bond into evidence of conspiracy, and our attempts to clear Mom's name into what looked like an elaborate cover-up. What do we do now? I whispered. Rebecca's voice was steady despite the circumstances. Now we prove that Tom Morrison is exactly as smart as he thinks he is, and that's going to be his downfall. The courtroom was packed when Morrison finally took the stand 3 weeks later. His lawyer had fought the testimony from Rebecca and 2 other victims we'd managed to track down, but Judge Williams had ruled that the pattern evidence was admissible. Morrison sat in his perfectly pressed navy suit, silver hair immaculate as always, radiating the same confident authority that had fooled our community for 8 years. But I wasn't the same naive 17-year-old who trusted him with my college dreams. I was the kid who'd spent every afternoon since our arrest warrants were issued working with Janet and a forensic accountant to unravel 20 years of financial fraud. And I discovered something that was about to end Thomas Morrison's career forever. Mr. Morrison, Janet began, holding up the email he'd sent to Rebecca, you wrote to Ms. Chen that some people never learn to cover their tracks properly. What did you mean by that? Morrison's smile was practiced, sympathetic. I was simply offering moral support to someone who'd made serious mistakes in her past. Rebecca has struggled since her unfortunate involvement in that Sacramento case. Unfortunate involvement? She was framed for theft, by you. That's a serious accusation, Ms. Morrison. I was merely a concerned colleague who tried to help when discrepancies were discovered. Janet walked to the evidence table, retrieving a thick folder I'd helped organize. Let's talk about discrepancies, Tom. Can you explain why the fake vendor, Martinez Educational Services, appears in fraudulent transactions across 3 different states, spanning 15 years? Morrison's composure flickered for just a moment. I'm not familiar with. Really? Because Martinez Educational Services appears in Rebecca Chen's case in 2003, Sarah Martinez's case in Colorado in 2011, and my client's case here in Westfield. Same company name, same billing address format, same signature on all the fraudulent receipts. Janet spread out the documents. Either this is the most unlucky educational supply company in America, or someone's been recycling the same fake vendor for 2 decades. The prosecutor objected, but Judge Williams allowed the evidence. I watched Morrison's face as Janet laid out transaction after transaction, each one showing his signature administrative style. The man who'd mentored me through college applications was learning what it felt like to have his own methods used against him. And then there's this, Janet continued, pulling out the piece of evidence I'd found that would seal Morrison's fate. The metadata from the supposedly fraudulent files on Alex's phone shows they were created using a specific software signature, Adobe Professional DC, version 15.0.20, registered to the Westfield High School District account. Morrison went pale. Many people have access to. Only 3 people in the district have administrative licenses for that specific version, Tom. You, the IT director, and the superintendent. The IT director was on vacation when these files were created, and the superintendent was in a documented board meeting. Which leaves you. I felt the shift in the courtroom's energy. The same parents who defended Morrison for weeks were staring at him with dawning realization. Mrs. Martinez, Tyler's mother, had tears streaming down her face. Furthermore, Janet continued, forensic analysis shows the fake documents were created in batches, then backdated to create the illusion of crime spanning years. The actual creation timestamps show systematic fabrication occurring over 3 days in September, right after Alex first accessed your computer. Morrison's lawyer tried to object, but the evidence was overwhelming. 20 years of using the same methods, the same fake companies, even the same specific phrasing in forged documents. The man's arrogance had finally trapped him. The defendant will rise, Judge Williams said 2 hours later, after the jury returned with their verdict. On the charges of embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy, we find the defendant guilty on all counts. Mom grabbed my hand as Morrison was led away in handcuffs. The Martinez Memorial Scholarship Fund would be restored. The robotics team got their state competition money back. Most importantly, the man who'd spent 2 decades destroying innocent families was finally being held accountable. Outside the courthouse, Tyler Martinez found me on the steps. Alex, he said, his voice thick with emotion, Maria would have been proud of you. Thank you for not letting him get away with it. As reporters crowded around asking questions about the Westfield High scandal, I realized Morrison had been right about one thing, I really was going to do great things. Just not the way he'd expected.